Alone is not your sentence. It is the ground where the new you is born. Sit with it, and you will be surprised who arrives. There is a moment when being alone ceases to feel like punishment and begins to feel like invitation. People often treat loneliness as a problem to be fixed, a social deficit to be repaired with more likes, more texts, more noise. But what if loneliness were less a gap to be filled and more a threshold to be crossed? Imagine a doorway that looks like absence from the outside. Cold stone, no handrail, an uncertain landing. The fear is healthy. Thresholds always demand courage. But beyond that simple passage lies a different quality of life. Not better in superficial comfort, but truer in depth. The threshold metaphor is useful because it implies liminality, a state of in-between. You are no longer who you were when you were surrounded by familiar opinions, familiar comforts, and familiar defenses. Nor are you yet who you will be once the alchemy of solitude does its work. Thresholds unsettle identity. They require that you unclench from the stories that have kept you safe but small. You begin to feel certain aches, the body's memory of old patterns, the mind's rehearsed explanations, the social self's craving for validation. The trick is not to blot out these aches, but to witness them with a steadier gaze. Crossing the threshold requires a few practical attitudes. First, allow the discomfort without urgency. Many flee the threshold by finding noise, scrolling, workaholism, superficial relationships, because the inner silence seems unbearable. But the flight only prolongs the passage. Second, convert resignation into question. Ask not why me, but what could this ask of me? The latter prepares you for action. The former keeps you trapped in complaint. Third, slow the tempo of your life. Thresholds are not meant to be sprinted through. Walking slowly exposes the contours of the terrain. The small acts of intentional slowing, a longer walk, deliberate pauses, less social clutter, alter your nervous system and permit interior rearrangement. There is also an ethical dimension. When you treat loneliness as threshold, you are being invited to take responsibility for your interior life. This is not vanity, it is maturity. You begin to see that the condition of your inner house matters for the world you will build. A person who simply avoids solitude can carry unresolved patterns into every relationship. A person who passes through solitude can bring a clearer presence into the same relationships, transforming them. The threshold is therefore a service. Your interior becoming is an offering to the world when you return. Finally, remember the paradox. The very isolation that once felt like loss becomes in time the source of your authority. People who have gone through solitude well are less fragile to opinion because they have learned to be companion to themselves. They do not need constant external applause. They have cultivated an inner audience that tells them the truth. Walk through the threshold. It will unsettle you. It will make you grieve, but it will also prepare you to be present in ways you never were before. Solitude does not arrive as a single neat episode. It has phases, textures and rhythms that, once recognized, permit a more skillful passage. If we consider solitude anatomically, we can name at least 3 primary zones: the initial ache, the reflective middle, and the creative reshaping. Each zone demands a different posture of attention, and understanding them helps you to avoid panic or premature reaction. The initial ache is honest and visceral. It feels like emptiness, as though the world has been scaled back to a room with bare walls. In this phase, you may replay old scenes: the friend who abandoned you, the job that failed, the lover who left. The body remembers pattern more quickly than the mind. You may feel an old fear of abandonment that predates your current circumstances. The key in this stage is tenderness. Resist the temptation to anesthetize the ache with distraction. Allow the feeling to have air, to be named. Label the sensation: I feel hollow, or I miss being known. Naming reduces the panic and begins the differentiation between the felt crisis and your permanent identity. The reflective middle is less dramatic but deeper. Here the mind, no longer frightened by noise, begins to narrate anew. You will find your thinking asking serious questions. Who am I without the roles I played? What have I accepted as true that may not be mine? This stage is a laboratory. Practices that invite observation, journaling, quiet walks, sustained reading, become tools of interrogation. You learn to notice patterns rather than be driven by them. Reflection in this phase is not navel-gazing. It is disciplined noticing with the intention to change. The creative reshaping is the outcome when reflection moves toward practice. New priorities form, Habits shift, small experiments are tried. You begin to test new boundaries, to speak different truths, to invest time in self-initiated projects. Reshaping requires stamina because the culture prizes quick fixes. Transformation is slow work, but the rewards are durable. A person who has reshaped in solitude is less likely to relapse into past compulsions because their inner architecture has been altered. New neural pathways, new ritual patterns, new companions chosen for resonance rather than convenience. There are practical guardrails. Track the phases without moralizing them. The ache is not failure. It is signal. Reflection is not indulgence. It is discipline. Reshaping is not arrogance. It is fidelity. Also remember, the timeline is not linear. You may move through these phases in cycles. Returning to reflection during creative labor when new blind spots surface. Adopt practices that fit each stage. Comfort and containment in the ache. Curiosity and questions in reflection. And rigorous small-scale experiments in reshaping. Anatomy gives you liberty. Once you understand the structure, you can refrain from panic, make better choices, and steward your interior with the kinds of acts that produce sustainable change. Solitude then becomes a sculptor, not a saboteur. To speak of loneliness without acknowledging grief is to speak half a truth. Grief is often the currency of solitude. Loss of relationship, loss of identity, loss of a version of the future we once expected. But buried within grief lies the shadow. Those unrecognized or disowned parts of ourselves that only appear when the external scaffolding falls away. The shadow is not condemnation. It is raw material. If you engage it with care, the shadow becomes the matter of alchemy. Grief first demands attention. People attempt to skip it because grief feels chaotic and risky. Yet grief is not a pathology. It is a teacher. When you allow sorrow to be present, you uncover what mattered in the first place. You see the values that were trod upon, the desires that were postponed, the compromises that drained you. This revelation is the alchemical input. The shadow shows patterns of blame, projection, and fear. These are not indictments. They are data. Alchemy in psychological terms means transformation by integration. The shadow contains impulses we have rejected: aggression, desire, pride, fear, which, when unexamined, sabotage relationships because they act out unconsciously. Integration involves acknowledging these elements within a supervised inner space. Say to yourself, I notice the part that wants revenge, or I see the part that wants to perform. Naming is practical therapy because it separates impulse from identity. You gain the ability to choose rather than be driven. Importantly, alchemy requires ritual and practice. The shadow cannot be negotiated with through thought alone. Somatic practices, symbolic acts, and expressive arts permit the energy to reorganize. Let anger run its natural course in contained ways. Exercise controlled expression or creative work. Offer forbidden desires to transformation through disciplined rehearsal. If ambition once required overreach, restructure it into steady apprenticeship. The point is to submit the shadow to a disciplined refinement rather than to suppression. There is moral work here too. Alchemy asks you to take responsibility for how your shadow has impacted others. That may involve apologies, restitution, or clarified boundaries. Responsibility is not self-punishment but remedial architecture. You repair what you can and reformat your behavior going forward. The world will not always be ready for the new you, but the act of repair makes you reliable. Remember that grief and shadow, while painful, are the raw ore of a more soulful life. The person who has mined them becomes less brittle and more capacious. They can receive both joy and sorrow, without being shattered because they have already encountered the subterranean material of their own psyche. When the external crowd falls silent and the old scripts stop playing, a new voice often emerges, not loud but persistent. Call it the inner voice, the soul's register, the small compass that points toward life that fits. Many people have learned to distrust this voice because it is quiet and seems impractical. Yet it integrates patterns of meaning that reason alone misses. Listening to it is a habit you can cultivate. Begin with attention. Attention is the simplest and most powerful skill you can train. Short sessions of mindful attention, 5 or 10 minutes of sitting quietly, allow small intimations to surface. Note the imagery that appears, the sudden preferences, the recurring metaphors. The inner voice often speaks in metaphor more than in propositions. A bird that keeps returning in your dreams, a recurring phrase, a deep curiosity about a specific practice. Treat these impressions as clues. Language matters. When the inner voice offers temptation or direction, practice translating it into small experiments. If you feel drawn to teach, start a short conversation circle. If you feel invited to write, attempt a paragraph a day. The inner voice rarely mandates grand leaps at first. It suggests small fidelities. Use those small acts as proof of concept. The voice will respond. If you steward it well, it grows clearer. If you neglect it, it becomes faint and distorted. Also, cultivate discriminating trust. Not every inner commentary is wise. Anxiety and fantasy masquerade as intuition. Learn to test the voice. Is this urging aligned with steady values? Does it persist after the mood passes? Does it invite life and responsibility rather than escape? The inner voice that indicates rebirth generally asks for disciplined acts rather than impulsive retreats. The inner voice is relational. It often surfaces in response to ethical questions. How do I want to be in the world? What kind of presence do I want to hold? Listening cultivates an interior covenant. You begin to answer honestly to yourself. The repetition of small, faithful acts builds integrity, and integrity amplifies the inner voice's clarity. Finally, record the voice. Keep a notebook of impressions, experiments, and outcomes. Over months, you will see a lineage of guidance that becomes increasingly reliable. The soul has its own pedagogy. Learn to be its student. Rebirth without ritual is fragile. Rituals act as scaffolding for internal change. They consecrate, stabilize, and translate inner shifts into daily life. Importantly, rituals do not have to be ornate. The power is in repetition and meaning. A morning practice of 3 breaths with a simple intention stabilizes the day. A weekly evening practice of reflecting on small victories consolidates learning. The trick is to make rituals small enough to be sustainable and emotionally resonant enough to matter. Rituals function on several levels. They modulate the nervous system. They create symbolic continuity, and they produce memory traces that support new identity. A solemn morning routine signals to the body that this person is someone who values presence. Over time, these micro-acts rewrite preferences. A life that once defaulted to distraction now defaults to attention. Choose rituals aligned with rebirth aims. If compassion is a priority, design acts that cultivate it. A regular check-in with a friend, a letter of gratitude each week, a supervised service commitment. If creative expression matters, set aside a fixed time for craft. The goal is not productivity but fidelity. Small consistent acts that compounded alter disposition. Make the rituals sensory and symbolic. Light a particular candle for reflection. Use a specific cup for tea that you only drink during contemplative moments. Objects embody transitions. They help the nervous system register the difference between old automaticity and new intention. Community rituals amplify personal ones. Find or create a modest circle, a book group, a listening pair, a weekly walk with a companion who honors your process. Shared rituals provide witness and accountability. They also democratize rebirth. You discover that others are undergoing their own transformations, which reduces shame. Finally, be adaptive. Rituals should evolve with growth. What anchored you at the outset may feel constraining later. Recraft them, not to abandon discipline but to honor deeper integrity. The essence is not the form but the fidelity, the commitment to show up for the inner work even when no one else is watching. Humans live by narratives. Loneliness often announces itself as the collapse of the stories that once made us feel worthy. The question of rebirth is therefore partly a narrative task. Which stories do you keep? Which do you discard? And which do you author anew? Reclaiming meaning requires careful attention to the stories currently governing your life. Begin by inventorying the dominant arcs you inhabit. Which narrative runs when you evaluate success? I must perform to be loved, or I must be safe to be valued. See which stories belong to your childhood, which are borrowed from culture, and which are chosen. Many of us carry default narratives that were adaptive at one time but now limit us. Naming them loosens their grip. Next, practice authorial choice. If a story no longer serves, draft a different one and act into it. If you believed I am only worthy when I am useful, try a new script. My worth is inherent. Uses expression, not definition. Acts follow stories. You do not rewrite narrative by wishing alone. Small deeds must embody the new meaning. If you claim generosity as a core, act generously in manageable ways. Meaning is also found in service. Loneliness can be healed when one's interior growth benefits another. When your rebirth produces a teaching, a practice, a repaired relationship, your life's narrative enlarges into contribution. This move from inward repair to outward offering is crucial. Rebirth without social consequence is private vanity. Rebirth that enriches others becomes a living myth. Finally, remember the humility of narrative work. Stories are provisional. Test the new arcs, allow them to be corrected, and be generous with yourself when old scripts reassert. Reclaiming meaning is less about creating a flawless story than about cultivating a storyline that honors growth and responsibility. Emerging from solitude requires a relational audit. The persons who sustained your old identity may not be the ones who fit your new one. This does not mean a callous purging of friends. It means discerning resonance. Some relationships will deepen into soulful companionship. Others will naturally fall away because the quality of your presence has changed. Begin by asking honest questions. Who honors my emerging truth? Who drains me into old reactive patterns? People who react with curiosity and steadiness tend to be allies of rebirth. Those who insist on old roles or who punish your change reveal conditional loyalty. This clarity is merciful. It spares you the exhaustion of convincing people to love the version of you they preferred. The process of release is often quieter than we expect. You do not necessarily announce an exit. You create distance by changing rhythms and choosing different investments of time. Yet moral integrity demands repair where necessary. If a relationship suffered because of your unintegrated behaviors, offer the work of amends before you disengage. Release with dignity. Leave behind no loose ends of cruelty. Inviting deeper relationships requires courage. The new you will need companions who can hold complexity, who can handle your boundaries and your inner work. Seek those who practice truth-telling with compassion, who provide witness without trying to fix, and who encourage autonomy alongside connection. These are the people who will hold the field as you grow. Finally, set relational rituals. A monthly check-in, a pattern of honest conversation, and a practice of listening without advice cultivate the soil for deeper ties. Friendship becomes sacred when both parties commit to growth rather than mere comfort. Once a new clarity has formed inside, the world asks for translation. How will you now act? Courage after silence is not a sudden grand gesture, but a sequence of consistent, ethically minded acts. The temptation is to prove the transformation with spectacle. Instead, choose integrity. Begin with small, verifiable commitments. If you have clarified boundaries, enforce them in small contexts. If you have discovered a vocation, test it with modest public acts. Courage accumulates. A single principled conversation, a steady withdrawal from harmful habits, a new schedule of study. These micro-acts compile into a visible pattern of change. Action must be tethered to accountability. Announce experiments to a trusted witness who can offer feedback. This prevents impulsive heroism and ensures the courage is not mere performative risk, but relationally responsible pursuit. Also measure outcomes with humility. Courage without reflection can become vanity. There is moral risk. Some people will resist your change and attempt to pull you back. That is part of the test. Remain patient and clear. Courage that is ethically directed may be uncomfortable for others but is consistent with integrity. Don't conflate displeasure with failure. Finally, embed courage in service. Let your actions serve others, not just self-affirmation. The greatest authority you can claim after solitude is usefulness. Teach, mentor, repair, create. When courage operates as contribution, the new life proves itself true. The self that emerges from loneliness is a gift precisely because it is forged in attention, grief, and disciplined recreation. It arrives with tenderness and authority, but it is also a test. Will you live by what you learned, or will the culture's old temptations erode your gains? The answer determines whether rebirth was authentic or merely stylistic. Live the gift with practices, continue your rituals, maintain your companions, and accept the slow work of repair where needed. Treat testing moments as opportunities to demonstrate fidelity. A small insult, a financial squeeze, a relationship pressure. Use these as experiments in staying the new course. Each tested moment that you pass strengthens character. Remember generosity. The new self's highest vocation is to be useful without calculation. Let your life be a living sermon of presence and steadiness. Teach by example. Offer your attention to those still in the threshold. Be a lantern rather than a pedestal. Finally, hold humility. Rebirth is not a final state but an ongoing discipline. Remain open to correction, to further grieving, to more teaching. The strength that lasts is elastic and merciful, spoken with warmth and quiet authority. Loneliness was never the enemy, it was the workshop. If you sit faithfully long enough, attend to the ache, listen to the small voice, and fashion rituals that root your new life, you will not merely return to who you were. You will arrive as someone consecrated by solitude, tender, clear, and capable of giving your life away without emptiness. Embrace the rebirth. The world needs the person only you can become.